Yeah, it was nice this morning. The pigs were enjoying it. That's for sure. So
Oh, yeah, there you go.
pigs were enjoying the cooler weather. We walked into the barn and they're just laying there. Normally they're like, all right, we're hungry, let's go. They were very comfortable this morning. And George, we go in and my sister-in-law's leaving. She came up for the weekend and is going back to Oklahoma today. So we went over to say goodbye to her. And my niece and nephew were over too, who are younger than my kids. And so there was just this pile of children all running around the barn. And George is just laying there and he's going, please don't make me get up. He's just just very chill. And he's like, fine, I'll come out and play. So he did. But that's Georgie. So, all righty. Well, I think we'll get started, and then whoever jumps in can jump in, and whoever needs to jump out can jump out. And so thank you. Normally, who shows up for the first one is not an adequate representation of who's actually interested. It's who shows up for the second class that I'm like, okay, who's actually interested in this? And a lot of you came back, so thank you so much. And I know that I asked you to do a much more difficult reading this week, both in terms of length, and I think in terms of processing it is a little less straightforward. I caution you that I feel like this particular reading is a little more Wendell Berry than the last one. So the ones we're going to be reading from here on out will feel more like this, but I hope that you are able to extract some meaning out of this, and I'm looking forward to processing this with you. But I wanted to begin. I wanted to thank all of you who were able to go into the Google Drive and leave some questions. The questions and the responses were pretty interesting. I had a chance to go back in and try to respond. And so I check in on there every other day or something like that, so we can continue these conversations. But so I encourage you to go back and look at last week's. But was wondering if there were any lingering questions, anything that popped up for you, just anything kind of left over from last week before we dive into this week. Yes, ma'am.
I had one question. I was looking to email this to you later, but since you asked, in the last session, you had mentioned that the Amish were a type of agrarianism, but not. Is that because it's a religious-based structure that they're holding to, not necessarily agrarian, or why wouldn't they be considered an agrarian culture?
Yeah, I wouldn't. For me, and I'm happy to pass this around if other folks have opinions, but I think it's absolutely agrarian. It's just there are different ways of being agrarian. So the fact that it's based in a religious kind of understanding certainly lends something to that. I also think even in the Anabaptist the larger Anabaptist tradition that Amish are in, there's different kinds of agrarianism that pop up. So, for instance, Amish practice one kind of agrarianism where Mennonite would practice a slightly different version, all the way down to some of the brethren and even brethren in Christ, some of those kind of things. So, and then there's certainly an atheistic, and I don't mean like militant atheism. What I mean is an agrarianism that doesn't practice any kind of religious observance, is rooted more in environmentalism, I would say. So I think they're absolutely agrarian. It's just one unique way that agrarianism plays out. And one of the things I want to make sure we don't do is, as we talk about agrarianism, not mistake the fact that only sort of this Amish image is the only thing that agrarianism can be, because I think that kills the conversation pretty quick, because it's almost a cliche. So there's lots of different ways for us to practice this, I think. But that's a good question.
I don't know if this is another cliche or not, but Libby had an interesting question about how do you, if you're landless, how do you gain an appreciation for the land? It was something along those lines. How do you learn the value of land? And that brought me, I didn't really get into typing out the question, but that brought me to, wasn't there a Supreme Court decision last week on the Native Americans, like in Oklahoma?
Oklahoma, yep.
Being entitled to most of the state, or the eastern half of the state, or something like that. And that reminded me of that, and the Native American aspects of looking at land in such a way that it's owned by all and not democratically in the way that we look at land, as you or somebody else said, that maybe Wendell Berry said it, is that one of our founding fathers was all about making sure that everybody had land. But in the Native American world, like everybody owned all of the land.
Mhm.
And that brought me to the thought of what about the public lands? You know, Libby was saying, well, if you're landless, how do you know the value of land? And that brought me to the first thought, but it also brought me to the like, there's a lot of public lands. I live in Pennsylvania, and there's like a tremendous amount of public lands in Pennsylvania, and there's also a tremendous amount of public lands in the U.S. You know, or national parks and monuments and things like that. But in Pennsylvania, I don't know, there's some huge percentage of public lands that are owned, I guess, by all of us and available for us to use. So that was just another thought that came from last week,
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
it continues this week, I think.
I saw Libby's question, and I won't. I encourage everybody to go back and look. I mean, I'd even like to read what I wrote. But I said this idea. I think there's something implicit, something inherent in us that is drawn to land, and that's a religious conviction. Like as we look at the African American, as we look at the African experience in the United States, even those who were born in an enslaved state. Still had this draw back towards land, like they understood it even if they didn't own it. I think we see that in native cultures as well. So I think there's still, I don't think we have to be landed, I don't think we have to be landowners in order to have this draw back towards land. That's a very short and a very introductory answer, but that was my most implicit, my most in the forefront kind of thing. My foremost answer to that is actually, as we look across our history, we see this draw towards land, regardless of whether we've had it to call our own or not.
And now this week we move into sense of place. Wendell Berry is all about being connected to the land of his
Yes.
ancestors.
Yes.
And I don't know that he owned. Maybe I didn't follow all that, but he walked through this land step by step and was very intimate with it. But I'm not sure he owned all of it, or it was just the hollows and ridges of his childhood.
Yeah. So it wasn't immediately obvious to me either if it was his place or just the larger ecosystem. But I think he owns some of it. But that's.
I think he did. He owned some of it.
This is good stuff. Maybe we should have done 2 weeks on industrial versus agrarian.
Well, I found a big difference between last week's reading and this week's.
Oh.
In that last week was very farming oriented. And this week's reading seemed to be more, how do I want to say it? Not so much having to do with farms, but just the forest and the landscape and things like that. In other words, he talks about taking walks in the woods and things like that, without any mention of farms per se.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And was that an odd shift for you? Was that jarring, or did that seem to work together for you?
It's kind of funny. I mean, I'm probably the only one, hopefully not, but sometimes when we're on a trip, this is before all the virus and stuff, and we're just driving through a wooded area, I often imagine or try to imagine having the ability to just have a time machine in that area of the country and just go back 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, just to be able to wish to be able to see what it was like then as opposed to now. Mm-hmm. So am I weird, or is anybody else?
I'm weird with you, Mike. I love that thought too. So yeah, I totally agree.
It was definitely a lot more about his personal connection to the place. And, with what you're saying also, the key, his great-great-grandparents were from that place. And so that's one way that his personal connection you know, that's how he connects to the land beyond just that.
I also
Walking
have the
through the
same
woods,
feelings he did
and
when
what you're
he
saying
talked
about how.
about, sorry.
Alex, I think you broke up a little bit, so you finish your thought.
Oh, okay, yeah. Maybe I don't have the greatest service out here, but I was just saying that like that personal connection is in part like his familial connection to it, and in part, you know, his own personal growth growing up there and embracing the landscape. So I don't know. I think there's tons of different ways we connect to it.
Yeah.
Sorry, someone else. Sorry, I know Canadians say sorry
No,
a
go
lot.
ahead.
Somebody else was.
Go ahead. I'll go next.
But I found it interesting. In contrast, Mike, I found a lot of similarities between the two pieces, because I think there's this undercurrent that Wendell Berry has around violence, the violence of industrialism. And even when he was talking in this article about how the road builders ended up, you know, that the act itself was violent, as opposed to the pathways that were similar that indigenous people would use. And I appreciated reading last week's first, because I don't think I would have seen those themes in this article if I hadn't, because I think, you know, I think even the concept where we ask the question, well, did he own the land, is an industrial concept. I think he finds himself connected to the land in something that is more spiritual than that is over and above the concept of ownership that is our norm, right? And I think that's an industrial norm and an individualistic norm. And so anyways, I saw some similarities that I really appreciated, and that whole theme of violence towards land is really resonating with me.
Go ahead, Michelle was next, I think. Sorry, Michelle.
Oh, hey. So most of my church family knows where I live, but my new friends that I met here last week, you don't. But what I was getting out of what's being said and everything was, and I have to write notes because my memory is short, but I think I'd like going back to what I call the simple basics of just, you know, my dad owned the property that I now live on, and it's going to be short-lived because I will be moving into a township in a senior apartment complex probably within 18 months. But mine is basically the appreciation of the land, the respect, and just, I am not a big traveler. I probably never will be, but I have with friends been to North Carolina just to see and be able to pull over to see a real live cotton field in growth was amazing. Thanks to Tommy and Vicki Mayo. And just like I've been to Ohio, locally I've been to Penn State. And when I went with my friend Randy, I referred to it as the mini Rockies. Oh look, I'm seeing the Rockies today, because it's basically the only mountain of rock that I've seen. And I just to see, like, going back to the one person who shared about just pulling over to an old home or an old estate that may have a little tiny family cemetery in the front yard, which I saw in North Carolina numerous times. It's just the stories. You look at these old homes and estates, excuse me, where you think, wow, I bet that house or that estate could really do some talking and tell some stories. You know, whether it's farming and agriculture or just family living, the ways and means that they were 100 or more years ago. And I just find that fascinating. And just from where I live, and when I move from there, I'm just going to miss what I call living on the pike. And, because I'm not going to be able to stand and wash dishes and look out the front window anymore and see nothing but a farm and trees. So, it's just like, I think for me, it's just easy and simple for me to say the simple basics of appreciation of the land and respect. Needless to say that I've got pumpkins growing in a plastic clothes basket in my driveway that I'm so happy with.
Yeah. And I think the way you speak to that is a great way to enter this conversation of saying, just pay attention to what's around you. And I think that's one of the things I wanted you to get out of this lesson is pay very close attention to what is actually there. We'll jump into that here in a second, but Vicki, did you have something you wanted to say?
It was, for me, this reading, I could connect to much more than the reading before. The discussion was interesting with it and all. I totally agree. Some of that comes from my genealogy and research and all. The land that Michelle's talking about, those were cotton fields where my ancestors had cotton plantations, So I have relatives that still live on property that my original immigrants, settled on in the early 1700s. So the buildings don't stand, but the land's there. And every time I pass that county line. It's sort of that same way when we come home, that we pass that Carroll County line and we all go, woo, It's that sense that you're home and there's something familiar about it. But for me, even though I never lived in that area of North Carolina, this connection to ancestors in that area and all, it's there. And I know Mom has the same connection with where her Virginia relatives were. So.
Yeah. So, well, very good. So let's dive into this a little bit. And again, like one of the things that I want to ask is, and I always enjoy hearing is, where are your underlines? Meaning, as you were going through this, like what were you underlining? What were you highlighting? All that kind of stuff. So as we're going through this text, feel free to pull out what grabbed you, as opposed to what grabbed me. But if nobody has anything, we'll talk about what grabbed me. But to give you a little background on this, today's essay, A Native Hill, was written in 1969. And I think there are ways in which it reflects 1969 realities. But nevertheless, I would suggest, and now I have not read all of Berry's work, but in my experience with his work, I think it's his best and most thorough treatment of his home in Kentucky. So we get not only a picture of sort of this Appalachian setting, and get a sense of how that particular landscape and culture is going to influence his writing. We get to step into his mind and get a sense for how he sees the world. Now, this doesn't mean that we necessarily need to see it in the same way, but if we're going to engage with an author, learning to see the world the way they see it, so that we can recognize where it's positive and also critique it, is a positive thing. And I think this is one of the clearest examples we have of being able to get into his brain and see his world as he sees it. If last week's essay, and Monique, I think you said, hey, I see a lot of connections to last week. I'm like, yes, all right, this is working the way I wanted it to. If last week was it was more intellectual in terms of concepts, like here are these two ideas that he's wrestling with. This week, we get to see how he feels about it. And I hope you can see the concepts we talked about last week emerging in this writing that's actually way earlier. That's what I said last week, that last week was written in 2002. But you can see how the concepts he talked about in 2002 are present in 1969, which I think is really fun. And so the theme that I want to present for today, as we work through this, it's a similar dualism. He doesn't talk about this, but I want to introduce this as people of faith, because these are words that we will often use in a context of faith. And it is the difference between exegesis and eisegesis. I know, Michelle, those are big words.
I think I'm going to have to start bringing a dictionary.
It's all right. No, I'm here to explain it all. Today we are going to learn today we're going to see how he reads his place. And there's two different ways of doing this: exegesis versus eisegesis. These two words get used a lot in biblical studies as we talk about biblical texts that we have. And it's two different ways of coming at a text. And so exegesis means that you begin with what is actually in the text. So exegesis starts by studying the text, its context, its culture, its literary style. Why does the author use this word and not that word? Why is it all the way down to why is it this preposition and not that preposition? Or, like it really gets into the nitty-gritty details of what the text actually is. It explores all the angles of a text and seeks to discover what is present there. And then as you discover what is actually there, meaning will emerge up out of that text. For those of you who are members of St. Mary's, I prefer to preach in this way. What is present here, and how does that create meaning for us? But eisegesis comes to a text and is looking for a message in the text already. Eisegesis says, here's what I want to talk from a preacher's point of view is here's what I want to talk about. Let me find a text that will reinforce what I think I want it to say. So it imposes a meaning from the outside. It doesn't start with what is present. It says, actually, here's what's in my head. It imports doctrine, it imports perspective, it imports history, it imports politics, and in this course of this text, like, can I make this text say the thing that I want it to say? And so it's meaning that is imposed from above, not meaning that emerges from the text itself. And one of the things I believe is that if we can exegete a text, we can also exegete a place. And I think as we gather as people of faith who are interested in how this lines up with faith, I think one of the things that we're struggling with more than anything else right now is we practice eisegesis on our place, try to impose meaning, try to force things upon places rather than understanding what that place is and what that place actually, what the realities of that place actually are before we go looking for meaning. And so I think Berry does a really wonderful job of helping us imagine what it would look like to exegete our places. In the same way that we exegete our scriptures, the same way we exegete our traditions, Berry is saying, let's pay attention to what is already here before we try to make meaning out of it. Meaning will emerge as we pay attention to the truth about our places, the truth that is beautiful, and as we discover in this essay, sometimes the truth that is unbelievably ugly, but name the truth nevertheless. And so that's where I see this text breaking down and gives us some things to think about. And so it's broken down into 3 sections. I guess you saw there were the big numbers, like almost like chapters in this essay. And so what I'd like to do is kind of do a flyover of each one of these sections and then kind of land at a place where we think about our own place, if that works for you guys. And so it begins, he starts not with his place, he actually starts with himself. He exegetes a little bit of his own history and a little bit of going back. Yes, Vicky is the genealogist par excellence around here, and so he begins in Vicky's wheelhouse, like looking back over his family's history and why this place in Kentucky matters so much to him. And so he starts with his own facts. And so I want to ask, just what are some of the facts that you noticed about him in the beginning of this essay? What are some of the things that he discusses, things he talks about in his own experience that stood out to you or maybe helped you make some meaning out of this essay? Because we're going
the time that he was born.
Okay.
The time of because he said if he were born 5 years later, things would be different.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so this is one of the things I noticed as well. So this idea of, if I was born 5 years later, things would be different. So being born when he was, what kind of impact did that have on his life as he explains it?
He still had that connection to the old ways, the plowing with the mules and, his grandfather teaching him and how to determine which are the best, which are the lead, which one leads. So he still has that connection with the old ways of doing things. And those are good memories for him too. He had those really good memories of doing that with his grandpa. I liked how he said something to the effect that, he was like like a kid playing like he was one of the men, and that was cool to him.
No, I love it. And I love that story of the mules. I've never worked mules. I don't know if any of you ever have or have any experience with them. Tommy does.
We've been around working with mules, I'll put it that way,
Yeah.
quite a bit. Yes, it's fun. It's really fun. I will not tell you what the old farmer called his mule.
We'll leave that for the Google Drive. We'll all guess.
Somewhere along the abbreviations of SOB. And that was the only name that mule had. And he farmed, how much did he farm?
Oh, a lot.
There was
With his
a guy
mule.
who did, he sold local produce where we used to go to an area for the beach. And we have fond memories going there. I also have fond memories of a mule. And my grandparents never owned a house, but they always rented. And one of the places they rented when I was growing up, because my mom's youngest brothers are my age, it was a tobacco farm. So yeah, I can really relate to the tobacco and the plants and the fields and all that. And there was an old mule that lived there that we used to ride. The old guy there. I don't remember whether he ever plowed with him or not.
Yeah.
I think at one time he had probably been a plow mule, but we had a good time with that old mule.
And I love this line as he describes this. I seem to have been born with an aptitude for a way of life that was doomed. And I wonder how many of us can identify with that, with how quickly society changes, right? It's like I adjusted to the last way life was, and the next way of life, I just don't have any energy to learn it. I think it's way more relevant than it feels, even though we're not dealing with mules. I just know for churches in the middle of COVID, trying to adjust to what Zoom meetings look like is so a lot of us are born with an aptitude for a way of life that right now seems doomed. It's not, by the way, for all the St. Mary's folks. We will be back here one day, but you get that sense.
It was that immediate jump that immediate jump in technology was so challenging and all, and still is, for a lot of people. Yep. I hear it quite often. Why is this doing this?
Mike, you were going to say something?
I was saying, I'm just looking at my little margin markups in the first part. And the first markup or thing I listed was, I'm just going to read it. For it has been our history that each generation in this place has been less welcome to it than the last. There has been less here for them. And each arrival there has been less fertility in the soil and a larger inheritance, destructive precedent, and shameful history. In other words, well, the way I took that to mean is it's each new generation has less an appreciation that he's talking about for the land.
I think also that kind of was, I underline that as well, and but then when he's talking about the professor, and it's as if what Mike, in follow up to what you're saying, Wendell is trying to reclaim looking at his life through the lens of land, where the professor is saying that, oh, well, the way that you're supposed to look through life is through the lens of being a writer, and place is at service to role. So, and he flips that on his head, where he says place, role is at service to your place where you are of. And his professor said, well, no, you got to live in New York, because New York is the place where you are a writer and not the other way around. And so he's kind of going back to try and reclaim that distance from the land a little bit.
I think that
was so awesome.
I was going to make a note of that too. And I think that that speaks to what Sam was saying about exegesis versus eisegesis, in that, like, the writer or the professor came with this idea that, like, this is what you need to do with your life. And he's saying, like, I want to be in this place. And, like, it's a different choice that he's making. He's drawn to something else rather than just staying in New York and writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. The professor story is another one that where he's recounting his own history. I think it's one of the major themes of this section 1. And yeah, this professor has this, to use the word violence sounds too heavy, but it's like the only way for you to progress as a human being is to uproot yourself. Like, which is in itself kind of a violent image. Even if we're tending a garden and we pull up the potatoes, like that is a destructive act. Just, but you pull something up in order to put it in a different place. And so he's saying, even in my professional career, which is relatively not destructive. I mean, he's teaching literature and he's a teacher, which is supposed to be productive. The only way to move forward with that is with this fundamentally violent image. And so he's saying, I too am impacted by violence that sort of seems inherent in our culture and the way we talk about things and the way we think about human thriving. This advisor of his just couldn't see a way of thriving that didn't involve going someplace else. And I never hear Berry knock New York City, by the way. This is not a Kentucky is preferable to New York. It's saying that New York is one place, Kentucky is another, and both have value insofar as we are connected to them. And so I found that piece of his own history to be an interesting way that he tries to create some meaning out of that experience of being told that he shouldn't go back home. Which
that's kind of an interesting concept that in the professional world today, it's commonly considered to be the route to promoting your career and moving upward and onward is to change companies and be flexible and be willing to move to another environment. I mean, I didn't think so hard on that. I was looking for the places that people said they had first underlined, but it brings me back to my first underlined part is on page 4. And it circles back to what you all are saying, that everything he did, all of any of us might know of ourselves is to be known in relation to this place. And he said he did most of his growing up there and his place and the history. It's on page 4. And since I did most of my growing up here and have had most of my meaningful experiences here, the place and history for me have been inseparable. And there's a sense in which my own life is inseparable from the history and the place. Complex inheritance. I've both been enriched and bewildered by it. But I didn't think too hard until you just said that about that's the way of the world is to pick up and uproot yourself. But Wendell Berry is talking about the sense of place and reconnecting to places that he was living and having meaningful experiences. And by the way, those meaningful experiences probably happened in a portion of his life where you're most impressionable, that developmental stage where things are most impressionable to you.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was interesting, though, that he doesn't always seem happy about going back. I mean, he makes comments about it takes a certain deliberateness. And, on page 5, he says, Kentucky was my fate, not an altogether pleasant fate. So it seems like while he has these connections, he feels, one of the things I underlined on page 4 was that he feels sort of adrift in between finding his own place. He says, he's different from his contemporaries that grew up in the city, but different from the people who grew up where he did 5 years later as well. And that it takes this sort of deliberateness to return to what he knows, to go back to the land that he's from.
I guess a killer observation. I really, really do. I just want to let that linger all by itself. And so I want to keep moving on. Again, I'm trying to be respectful of time. I want to stop and sit our feet in this Battle of the Firebrand story that he reads. And so, because I think he does, this is his most excellent work of saying, hey, here's our history. All right, and then making meaning out of history that he is not responsible for and did not participate in, but he's making the claim that it has affected him. And I think this can be a really powerful exercise for congregations, so Berry does this individually. He's like, here are these episodes that have influenced me and how I think about them. Then he says, here's an episode about my culture or my larger community. And he pulls this story from an old history book. I imagine it's some local, some guy who was writing some local history, and we're thankful that those people do that because they collect these stories. And so he tells this story. And so first of all, I want to ask, see if you remember, who wrote this story? Because I think it's significant.
It was a Methodist preacher, wasn't it?
It was a Methodist preacher. Okay, good. Yeah, I want you to hold that because I think it's important. And so can we rebuild this story real quick without reading the whole thing? Can we just remind everybody of this story as it goes down? So how does this story kind of open up?
We're building a road, right?
Yeah. So we have these
Yeah.
what he terms Kentuckians, describes them. They are prepared for wilderness survival.
Oh,
Yeah, they are going out. They are trying to create this, a society, a civilization. And so they're building these roads. Okay. And then what happens when they take a break?
instead of building a small fire, they just tear down a whole bunch of trees and build this great monster of a fire. And so there's more destruction happening. And then they can't even be satisfied with just destroying the land. Then they have to destroy each other.
Yeah, so there's this. So they're tearing down stuff and building roads, and then they go full West Virginia University, which is my favorite university, and they're like going full, let's burn the sofas, guys. And so, I mean, this actually feels in the beginning like a fun kind of party to be a part of. So they build these huge bonfires. There's all this going on, and then it turns to this really kind of bizarre thing. What do they end up doing?
They break into two groups, don't they?
Yeah. What are they doing to each other?
They fight.
Throwing firebrands.
Yeah, so they're lighting logs on fire and like throwing them at each other. Like I yell at my 12-year-old son for this, okay? But apparently this is part of the culture. And the only reason they had to be lit on fire is because it was night, so you at least had the opportunity to dodge because you could see them. All right, but then even then it breaks down and they actually start scrapping. Like it goes from like this boyish game, if I can use that, to actual violence until finally they have to shut the whole thing down.
And also at the beginning, Sam, just there's that underlying differentiation between indigenous. He says at the beginning that the indigenous way would be to enclose yourself in small space, and the people that are building the road, they look at consumption of land, so they're out in the open so that they can see so that what they can have power over is vast. Yeah. So there's that difference between indigenous and colonizer settler approach to the space in the story.
Yeah. And reflect on this. He says on page 10, the very first sentence on page 10, the significance of this bit of history is in its utter violence. And you've already identified a couple places where violence shows itself in this story. Can we identify a couple more? So we said the building of a road. We're coming to this road versus path thing. We'll hit that. Certainly we have throwing flaming sticks at one another. That seems like a violent act. Vicky illustrated, making big fires when a small fire would have done the trick.
Well, I didn't circle this, but like later maybe I'm out of that story, but there's in the article there's mention of farming and how they farmed the lower parts of the land, and that wasn't enough. They washed out those soils, so they went up into the steeper slopes, and they shouldn't have farmed it, and it wasn't designed for that kind of activity. And so I guess that's another
Mm-hmm.
you could characterize that as violence to the land. It's not natural. I don't know.
Are we generally in agreement that this is a violent story? Because that
Yes.
feels like a surprising word maybe to put on it. Like, we often tell this as a hagiography. We tell this was the frontier, this was, rough living, this was manifest destiny, this was going west, and becoming all that we were supposed to be. But here we're saying, and this is why I'm pushing this a little bit, we're saying actually this is full of violence. But I hear you all saying that, yeah, actually this is kind of a violent, or at least a very aggressive kind of a story. So we're in agreement with that. If somebody's not, now's the time, because I think this is an important point.
I agree, but I also think it's interesting that he says that just the simple act that these people behave this way in their history, he says, their survival among us promises ruin. So he's saying, like, the fact that they're doing all of this sets the tone for the rest of us, that's going to force the rest of us into ruin by their historical action.
And I love what he says on page 10, the middle paragraph. To testify to the persistence of their influence, it is only necessary for me to confess that I read the Reverend Young's account of them with delight. I yield a considerable admiration to the exuberance and extravagance of their fight with the firebrands. I take a certain pride in belonging to the same history and the same place they belong to. And I wrote in the margins, as much as we might condemn other people's violence, this is in all of us. He reads this story with a smile on his face, just like I'm doing right now. Like, I think there's a part of this story that I think is hysterical. Like, if I could just be honest. And yet, it's unbelievably violent. And then what I can't help but think about is to go back to who is telling this story, who wrote this story. It is a reverend who had nothing to say. He says this letter, he says this just in the next paragraph, who provides no commentary on this other than they knew but little. And I read this, and forgive a pastor for being this way, but I read this as how often the church is complicit in the violence that is implicit in our culture. The church blesses it. The reverend doesn't say anything. Like, all right, good rule. The first thing I learned in seminary is if people are throwing flaming sticks at one another, please tell them to stop. Like, that's rule one in seminary. You can figure out the rest later. Let's just not kill each other and burn everything down. And so he exegetes their history and says, wait a second, this is part of our history. It's here. It's not gone. It is present here. Even though we might not pick up sticks and throw at one another, he's saying, pay attention to the history and the violence that is present in the place where you are, both good and bad. And he'll talk about some good things later. But here he's like, we have to own the baggage that is our place and not pretend that, like, it's gone.
Well, human history is a history of violence.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been going on, one tribe of cavemen fighting another, or one group of Indians fighting another, or, as you pointed out, Sam, even the history of the church. And as a former Catholic, I'm thinking of the Catholic Church, of course. Talk about violent history. Oh my God, the torturing, the burning of supposed witches. It's just it's a bad part of being human. And all you got to do is turn on the TV today, and you see the same thing going on.
Mm-hmm. One thing that struck me too is, and I don't remember if it was when I was reading in this section or later when they were talking about building roads and destroying things and how destruction was such a part, was the violence in video games, and how we have, we haven't broken that cycle that, violence is fun. you know, and we have these generations now of people that are playing these violent video games for entertainment. And, you know, it just hasn't stopped. It hasn't broken.
Mm-hmm. And so he talks, and then we'll jump into the next section here, but I didn't want to pass over. But he's like, okay, so there's this destructive kind of thing, but he's like, that's not the only way of the world. He says there's a difference between a path and a road. And so can we lay out the definitions? What is a path to Berry, and what is a road?
Well, he said that a path kind of goes through where a path winds its way around what's already existing, whereas a road just blazes its own trail through whatever gets in its way.
Yeah. No, it's a good start. Can we look at his language a little bit more? Like, what he uses some really interesting words, I think. And again, I want to pay attention to his actual language.
I think he's saying a path is just a route or a way that people found convenient to walk, perhaps because it was a little clearer of trees or something, and they kept using it and using it and using it until it, you know, it was kind of a very easy to see place where maybe the grass wasn't grown anymore.
Yep.
Because of all the it's a footpath.
Yep.
Whereas a road, you know, was a big tarred highway.
Mm-hmm.
I think yes, he says that a path is not destructive. It's adaptation, it's familiarity, it's movement to the place. Familiarity, it comes from habit and understanding and being a part of the environment, whereas a road is resistance to its environment. It's destructive and it's a resistance. It says that somewhere. I think I even have it circled. It's actually resistance to the natural environment, and removes and destroys all of the obstacles in its way.
Yeah.
But, and also, a path is a habit.
That's the word that I think is really powerful.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
It comes with knowledge of a place. A habit that comes with knowledge of a place. Very good.
Yeah, so what we have, a path is not a geographic feature, it is a behavior. It is just a repeated behavior that happens inside of an ecosystem. We can do it. I know deer can do it. We've all stumbled across deer trails, you know, snakes will do this. Squirrels will do this. I mean, for better or for worse. You know, it is a habit. It's actually a behavior where it's not a geographic thing that is imposed on a place like a road is. A road set actually changes the landscape. It's not responsive to it.
Sam, I don't know if this relates or not, but I remember one of my trips out west, we made a stop, and right where we stopped, a man pointed out to us that the Oregon Trail had gone through there, and you can still see the ruts from the wagons from way back then. And I found that really interesting to see. I mean, I knew the story of them crossing across, but that the ruts were still in the land. And I don't know how far, I don't know how far you can see them, but we saw a pretty good distance of them.
Yeah, that's cool. And it's an interesting kind of thing because you have this path, but it's related to this manifest destiny kind of idea, which, you know, so that's an interesting thing to try to pull apart a little bit and kind of see what's going on with that particular feature. And so, but he puts in this idea of path and road. So what he does is that he pays attention to the story. He tells the history, and then you see what we've done. So get my little Post-it note out here because I wanted to make sure I had this. So when we exegete something, he starts with the data, he moves to its implication. So like, here's what we did, here's the implication of that, and then he moves to meaning. And so he says, here's the story of these firebrands, these firebranding people who are building a road. He said the implication is that there's a lot of violence inherent in our history. And he says, but there's a meaning to be made that let's be a little less violent and let's be a little more responsive to the contours of the place where it actually is. This is how exegesis works. He moves from a story to meaning, not looking for meaning and imposing that on a place. Like the Kentuckians that he was talking about were trying to impose something on there. And I think that is a really useful spiritual idea as we think about the places where we live. Wanted to make sure there was no comments on that. So moving on, because I'm trying to, time. So I want to move to part 2, where I think my sense of how he writes this, and I'm not a literature expert, so I might not necessarily be reading this right, but I think what he tries to do in section 2 is to do the thing that he identifies in section 1. So he doesn't want to go down a road. He doesn't want to go to specific places and try to make meaning out of them. He goes on a walk, and he regularly says, I am going where the water is going. I don't know if you remember, like, he's like, so I'm going to start at the top of the hill and I'm working my way downhill. And so this imagery of water, going where nature naturally wants to go, even if that has been changed by human behavior, he says, I'm going to walk a path. And he says, now I'm going to exegete my geography. So if in part 1, he's exegeting history, his own and his people's, part 2, he wants to exegete the actual geography. And this brings up some really, really fascinating things. Now, I'm going to admit this was the hardest part of the reading for me. But I wonder, as he's taking the journey, I wonder what geographies kind of came to mind for you. As he talks about water and talks about soil and talks about some of these things, I wonder if it took you to a particular place. And if so, what is that place?
Well, for me, it just took me to where I grew up on the family farm. You know, you could go on a walk down through the pasture along the stream, or, you know, or anything like that. So whether it's as a kid, a path around and through the buildings and stuff, was either walking or on my bike, or just even reminders like after something simple as, you know, after a storm, trying to check that the fence was fine and walking out with my dad and walking around the pasture fence all the way around looking for, you know, damage or if something was shorted out or anything like that. So it brought back some nostalgia for me of things that I would do or do with someone in the family.
Any other family farms that got revisited in the mind? Because mine certainly did. Anna, you too?
I did a lot of that, and I couldn't help but thinking about how this was relating to how I remember the farm the first 22 years of my life. And you talk about paths, well, the cows know the paths, and they take the least. Point. They take the least resistant way to get from the pasture to the barn. And they'll follow the path, and you can easily tell what it is because it's on the ground. They just go it all the time. So, but yeah, I found myself just reliving farm life for my 22 years during the listening of this. Of course, Dot read it to me, but so yeah.
We need to get you to read it for everyone. I imagine hearing it sometimes is different than reading it. Story time with Dot next week.
Yeah, for me, there was this sense. I lived in England for almost 7 years, and all of the pathways did this. They all land in England is technically not owned by the people. They kind of own the property, but not exactly. It's Queensland, and they have these public walkways, pathways all over the place, and they always follow streams or walls, and streams particularly. And you would climb over a wall. There'd be a walkway to go over a walk up where we were. They were stone walls, and we would go up over. And all these pathways followed, and you never felt like you were going to get lost when you're following water. You know, the worst that happens is you turn around and you go back. So that kind of came to mind for me too. You don't get lost following water.
Interesting. So I'm going to put a bookmark here and say, I can ask permission for 10 more minutes to go beyond our time. As always, ask for permission. I'm not entitled to your time. So ask for an extra 10 if that's okay with everybody.
Yep.
And if not, feel free to log off. Our friendship is not ruined because you got to go. So I want to draw. So there are two things. There's a couple different things that are happening here. But I wanted to start with the stone-walled sort of pool that was created. Okay. And I wonder if there were, how you all, it's okay, Monique, thank you. And I wonder sort of how you all read that section, how you read that story. What was his tone towards that? Meaning, did he seem approving of this, or did he seem disproving of this? Was he saying this is a good thing or a bad thing, to oversimplify it a hair? See if I can find the page number for you.
For me, I felt like it was the reality of what it is, that these structures are all over the place and going away and eroding and things. There's signs of where man has changed things, and now it's going back to the land. It's changing the path. It's going back to the way it was in a lot of respects.
Any other thoughts about this pool?
Yeah, to Tommy's, or to on page 16, he said it's one of the monuments that was lost.
Can you say it again? Because you broke up just a little bit. I want to make sure I got it exactly.
Oh, it says on page 16, he says it's one of the monuments to what is lost.
And how do you hear that language? Does that feel like, is he mourning this? Is he mourning that this is lost?
He was mourning a lot of stuff.
What's that, Tommy? You can't whisper in this class.
Yeah, she doesn't know the speaker's still on.
Well, I missed so much today, and sorry. I forget what I said now. I forgot. You interrupted my thoughts. Yeah.
But yeah, I think as he fought, so I'll offer this. So my eyes kind of glazed over the first time I read this, and then I came back a second time to it. And I think what I hear is I think he's saying this is a positive thing that is being lost. I think he's mourning it, because the way that he describes it, let me see if I can find it. This tiny pool, no doubt, it's towards the bottom of that paragraph on 16. This tiny pool, no doubt, once furnished water for a considerable number of stock through the hot summers, and now it is only a lost souvenir, archaic and useless, except for the bitter intelligence there is in it. And I think what he's saying, and we're going to find one of the things that I struggle with about environmentalism as a movement is that it often wants to remove humanity from the equation. It wants to say the whole world would be better if there weren't any humans around. But Berry is always going to call us back and say that actually there are positive ways that we can impact our environment. It's okay for us to impact and to change the environment. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how are we doing it? Are we doing it in ways that are sustainable and life-giving? And I think what he's saying is that whoever put this pool in, this stone-lined pool, was thinking about, I have to create a water source for livestock, for animals. And so I'm going to do it in the least invasive way possible. I'm going to use the stream as it already is, collect water, and then allow our animals to drink from it and not have to always be creating water sources. Just this is going to be here in perpetuity. I'm going to put one thing in that is going to water our animals, as opposed to putting in 10 different things that ultimately will alter the landscape. And so I feel like he's saying it's okay for us to interact with our environment. It's okay to change things, but to be thoughtful in the way we are doing it. Because now we have such technology that allows us, literally I can have a cell phone one day. All right, it doesn't work anymore. I pitch it out. I go get another one. It doesn't work in 6 months. I pitch it out. I go get another one. There is this recklessness to the way that we use our tools. And what he's calling us to, I think, is to be more thoughtful in the way that we use tools. And so I hear this as something, he's like, it's okay for us to change our environments, but to be thoughtful in how we do it. Because it pays attention to the water. It pays attention to the path.
He also notes that when the pool was dug and walled,
Mm.
there was deep topsoil on the hill to gather and hold the water.
Yes.
But now, I guess over time, that topsoil has been washed away by the farming operations, which is also human activity.
Yes.
So that has changed. Things are different.
And where is that soil now? Where does he
It's-
say that soil ended up?
I guess it's all washed away.
It's
in the water.
It's in the pool.
It's in the pool, yeah.
It's in the
Oh,
pool.
okay.
And he's saying our thoughtlessness destroyed
Oh.
this thing that was very thoughtful.
That's the bitter intelligence,
Yes,
I guess.
exactly. And I contrasted this with the beer can. So on the one hand, you have this feature that was intended to be permanent, as much as any human structure can be permanent. This permanent feature that is intended to provide fresh, clean water, okay, and that responds to the water, as opposed to a beer can. And I think it's interesting that it's an actual beer can. This intoxicating beverage. I'm not anti-beer, but let's own it. It's this intoxicating beverage that comes in a can that can be just pitched by the side of the road. It too is a watering hole, but it is a temporary watering hole that can be easily disposed of. And I think in this way, this beer can is a type of violence as well, or at least a type of thoughtlessness that stands for so much in our culture. So we can either have a culture that is permanent and thoughtful, or a culture that is intoxicating. It is for the moment, and it is easily discarded.
I think that's Sam, if I can link that to something else.
Absolutely.
I think it's interesting then that later on, so I think I really appreciate his perspective. I do think that there's some romanticism involved in how he's looking at this, because he's also talking about there's a lot of community things that have to happen for us to respect the land together. And so I thought it was interesting later on, he talks about another piece of litter that he sees, this lantern that had been dropped, but it's different because he knows the person that dropped it and he has a backstory. And truthfully, yes, there's a difference between those things, but it's still not supposed to be on the land. He just sees one that he has the backstory to, so he knows it better. In my mind, that was an interesting link to the two things.
I think it's a fabulous and really thoughtful criticism. It's okay to criticize. You can love this and still be I have some questions about this. And you're calling out this romanticism, I think, is actually really useful, because I think it goes across the grain of what he's asking us to do. He's asking us to exegete our places, which means we have to tell the truth. But we can't have one set of truths for a beer can and another set of truths for a lantern just because it relates to us differently. Just because I know the story of the lantern and not the beer can doesn't mean the lantern is any less litter. I might know more about it. So his romanticism is kind of cutting across the grain of what he's asking us to do in terms of exegesis of our place. I think that's really well said. But that's my take. Y'all can, and there are plenty of people who want to hold on to Berry's romanticism with passion. So there's not a lot of circles you can say that, but I totally agree with you. So in interest of time, I really wanted to do the tobacco fields, and I'm really going to commend, especially to my church folks, but to all of you, the way that he talks about religion on page 22 going into page 23.
Oh, yeah. I was waiting for this.
I know. Well, look, I'm not going to be the typical pastor. I want to talk about that so bad, but I might do a couple of follow-up sermons on this, and I will be pulling on that painfully. Okay, so maybe this is something we can throw into the Google Doc and have some fun with. But I think the way he describes religion really gets at a lot of the problems inherent in Maine. And Tommy, I'm so glad you're feeling it. I'm right there with you. But I don't want to be the pastor who only wants to talk religion. So
I got marks all over that paragraph.
Good.
I have that paragraph marked too. It's one about when he talks about.
Well, I'll tell you what, we can do religion, or we can finish up with part 3. I've got 3 minutes for this.
I've missed so much, you can just keep on.
All right. Well, then we'll try to land this on a positive note.
Okay, I keep
because if part one is exegeting the history, part two is trying to be thoughtful to that history and follow the path and create some meaning out of it. I think part three is where he tries to imagine a different way. But he doesn't imagine a different way in terms of human alone. He goes to the forest. Okay, and he less on the water, though I've always imagined him being in a forest the whole time. But now he kind of turns his eyeballs upward towards the larger ecosystem that is there. And so he uses this trip into the forest to bring us a thought regarding the afterlife. There's a lot of death and a lot of afterlife that's happening on here, and I think it's really interesting. And what he's talking about in terms of afterlife, I might say as Christians we talk about as the kingdom of God. And so what does it look like when all things are in balance? And there are so few places we can go where things are in some kind of balance. One of the most life-changing things I ever saw, and Alex, I know you'll appreciate this especially, was the first time I stepped into an old-growth forest. And that absolutely, a place that had never been logged, a place that had never been touched, I mean, other than, minute, very, very small kind of things. And to have a glimpse back, I think, as Mike, was it you in the time machine that wanted to go back 200 years? That's old growth forest. It really is going back to the ecology. And it changed my mind, but it changed my entire way of thinking about things. And so he goes into the forest to see what it looks like when things are in balance. And one of the things I think is interesting is he mentions that the forest is very much at ease without us. Mm-hmm. The forest doesn't need us. The forest is not, dependent upon us. The forest is very much at ease without us. And so on page 26, right below the second set of stars, I want to draw your attention to this quote. He says, "There is an ominous, perhaps a fatal presumptuousness in living in a place by the imposition on it of one's ideas and wishes. And that is the way we white people have lived in America throughout our history, and it is the way our history now teaches us to live here." And so as we think about what it would look like to live better in the places where we are, he says we have to come to grips with this presumptuousness of imposing our ideas on a particular place. And he says it's inherent to us. And then he says the forest will do this for us. The forest will teach us how to do this. We will not learn how to do this by perpetuating the things that we have always done. And so what are some of the images that he draws from the forest about what it looks like when things are properly in balance? He identifies some very specific things, some images. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's peaceful. There's joy.
And what does he use to demonstrate the peace? Peace is one of them. Yeah. What does he use? What's the image of peacefulness?
The creatures seem to be at peace with the world.
He talked about darkness and silence.
Yeah.
I cut off. I also said the quiet of the forest.
Yeah, there's quiet, absolutely.
Yeah. I spent the nights in one night in the redwoods in California, and I noticed that it was so dark and so quiet, and I always said you could feel the trees. Yeah. You could feel the trees. It was just amazing by a little running brook. Mm-hmm. It was a great place.
And you're touching too with that comment on the sensory aspects. That he has a whole little couple sentences about the sensory aspects, the hearing and the lights and the colors, the odors, and just all of it, the whole experience of it.
Yeah, he talks about the wood ducks being very at peace, just kind of chilling. He talks about the fox squirrel, it hunched in the sunlight on a high elm branch beyond our window. Like even the squirrels, like, I'm going to get a couple of rays today. Then he talks about the heron coming in and doing the loop-de-loop. I have never seen a heron do that. I don't know if any of you have. I've seen herons. They're one of my favorite birds. They used to come down to the pond. But we get all these images. There's another one in here. Something is eating grapes. Forgive me. Said something was collecting food. I can't remember what it was. It's flying out of my head. But to bring this home as we're up against time, on page 30, he uses all these images inside of the forest, and all images that require no human interaction whatsoever. And he said, it seems so perfectly to confirm the presence of a free, non-human joy in the world. A joy I feel a great need to believe in, that I had the skeptic's impulse to doubt that I had seen it. If I had, I thought it would be a sign of the presence of something heavenly in the earth. And so I love this idea that he says there is a non-human joy in the world. That the world doesn't require us to make joy. The world is full of joy. The world doesn't require us to make peace. The world is full of peace. He also uses the image of Sabbath. The world doesn't need us to make Sabbath. It is already full of Sabbath. So everything that we hope for in a balanced world, in a world that is better than the one we occupy right now, is already present. And that is the message, that is the entire message of Christianity, that in Christ, God is setting all things right. There's this sense of returning to a place of balance, a place of what Jewish culture tells us is shalom, or total peacefulness. And so when we inflict violence, thank you, Christy. When we inflict violence, it's not the absence of peace. We're destroying peace that is already present. And so he's saying, as you learn to live in your places, trust that there is already goodness there. And if we pay attention to the land, it will teach us about the goodness that is present there. It will show us the goodness that God has already put there. Before God ever made a human, there was already goodness there. And that's why we exegete our places, because it will teach us. And I think that's where this spirituality, this religious idea that, we kind of skipped over today. Thank you, Abby. Is so important. And so I want to invite us as we're wrapping up here, is I hope you can see this pattern. When we practice eisegesis, it is so often destructive, whether we practice it on the land or on our communities or on people. When we practice exegesis up from the bottom, it reveals goodness. And the goodness is revealed even in the bad stuff, even in the beer cans, even in the lanterns, even in the roads. We learn something about what goodness actually looks like when we pay attention to these things. And so as people of faith, how do we practice exegesis, careful, thoughtful reflection on the places where we live? And that's the question that I'd like to leave us with today. This challenge that we have from Berry as he walks through this in this work called The Native Hill. So I will leave any last thoughts to you that you got to get out, or else you'll be really upset with me. And then we'll move this conversation over to Google Drive for the next couple of days as we continue to parse this out. Any final words?
Peace.
That'll do.
Peace.
All right then, guys. Thank you so much for hanging in. And I appreciate the extra time today. I will be sending out our next piece here in a next couple of days. I encourage you to do this piece one more time. Come back to the Google Drive. Let's keep the conversation going, okay? All right, y'all. Y'all are the best. Thank you so much. See you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.